Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support the channel on Locals, Subscribe Star, and Buy Me a Coffee. Today is episode 14 of the Political Commentary. Joined once again by Florian. Glad to have you back.
Glad to be here.
Class analysis of the Democratic Party. So we've been already talking about this before, but not like in one place. It's like, well, we're analyzing the Democrats' response to Trump's immigration policy, or we're analyzing Zoran Mamdani. But it's like, okay, you're getting this downstream from a crystallized perspective. And a lot of people might be wondering, well, what is my perspective? Well, my perspective on the Democratic Party is, we'll give you the short answer and then the long answer. The short answer is it's a party of scabs. All of its interest groups are scabs who serve as strike breakers in practice. Okay, so that's the short answer. Now, what's the long answer? Well, let's first of all say that, and these are critiques, by the way, that started coming from the progressive and far left of the Democratic Party. In the second Obama term, maybe even the first, they would point out that Obama got actually more corporate donor money than his Republican opposition, and that this was a pivot within the corporate elites to seek to purchase and buy control of the Democratic Party. Because, of course, you're beholden to the donors if you take their money. Also, right, they're supposed to be the party of democracy, the people's will. But if we look at, say, primaries, they're not very democratic at all, right? They have superdelegates. So in 2016, that was very important for Hillary Clinton getting the nomination, were the superdelegates, because that was where the corporate donors got to kind of lean on the Democratic Party and be like, no, we don't want Bernie Sanders. We want Hillary Clinton. And they got Hillary Clinton. The Republican Party does not have superdelegates, and arguably in 2016 was more, quote, responsive to the people, unquote, than the Democratic Party, because the Trump insurgency campaign could not have happened in the Democratic Party because superdelegates would have shut that down. And even though in the official Republican Party itself blasted Trump, spawning the Never Trumpers, he still won the popular support within the Republican Party. So in 2016 alone, we see that the Republican Party is more responsive to its own base. That doesn't mean they don't have corporate donors, but their control isn't as obvious as Hillary's. And of course, the Democratic Party, rather, with the superdelegates. And furthermore, Trump spent much less money than Hillary Clinton to win in 2016. So that doesn't really look like, at least at that point, 2024 is different. I'm not, but the thing is, though, it doesn't look like a corporate control takeover. It looks like the corporate donors at the time didn't want Trump getting in, but they didn't have the same kind of fail-safe the Democrats have with the superdelegates. So the Democrats historically would draw their base from working class blue collar people, like the Blue Dogs, who voted for Reagan back in the 80s, who come from the Rust Belt. But it was Clinton's policies of globalization that sort of screwed over the Rust Belt. And then Obama brags in a second term, I don't need to campaign with these guys. We don't need them anymore. So that's already just saying, dissing the historic base of the Democratic Party, working class people, right? So that's at the top level, they are more corporate controlled than the Republicans because they have, and you can measure this with the superdelegates as a sort of fail-safe, because the popular pick was Bernie Sanders. And I remember this was 2020, the 2020 campaign with Biden. Sanders was leading up until the Arizona, where there was some dodgy vote counting mechanism that all of a sudden just flipped everything in Biden's perspective. And at the time, there were progressive far left people saying that was rigged. And then, of course, he loses Vermont, his own home state, to Biden. Again, but then when Trump makes the claim that it was rigged, he's crazy. But of course, when Biden just catapults ahead of Sanders, there were people within the left that were saying that was rigged, because it was like, well, that's suspicious. I think it was called Dominion, something voting or something. It was really weird. Now, okay, now let's step back. Why do I say the Democrats are a party of scabs? What's a scab? There's a few different definitions, but a definition of a scab is either a strike breaker. So if you are on strike, he's the guy that goes into work, or he's somebody that make striking more difficult, right? So you're not actually in a strike, but his role in the workplace is to make striking harder. And of course, this is just a general label for pro versus anti-labor policies. A thing is what a thing does. So what would be optimal conditions for labor? Well, full or near full employment, because that means they could actually organize and strike. And the problem is then there's no strike breakers to ship in, because it's, you'd have to either have people coming from out of the country or a large body of unemployed people, right? And so otherwise, that puts the power in the hands of labor, which is ostensibly what the Democratic Party was supposed to be doing. But now it's not, right? We have the Whole Foods heat map from The Verge, the idea that diversity is itself a strike-breaking technique, where the more diverse it is, read non-white, non-male, that's what they're saying. The more non-white, the more non-male the workplace is, the easier it is to control. Wow, what do you know? I mean, back in the day when only white men were the workforce, they messed things up. If you were Irish, you might join the Molly Maguires and dynamite a factory. It got pretty dicey for these guys once you had a unified workforce. So this is not an accident that this happens. Okay, well, what happens if you have women enter the workforce? What happens if you have immigration enter the workforce? Well, let's stick with women. You double the supply of labor, which means you have the cost of labor. Immigration, depending on the level that you have, is just more on top. So if you have a diluted, saturated workforce, what you're doing then is creating an optimal condition for capital, but not for labor. And again, the rhetoric is that Republican Party is the party of capital and the Democrats are the party of labor. Not anymore. Second of all, who's most adversely affected by competition from immigrants? Well, poor Americans, right? We saw this with the 1863 New York riots, where Irish and blacks were fighting each other because they're competing for the same low-skilled jobs. And of course, the benefits, the Democrats are very concerned about immigrants getting benefits. Yeah, but that comes at the expense of the poor Americans who are already here. First of all, they did a complete about-face over the last 20 years. The poor, the Mexican immigrant labor that they're defending now against Trump's ICE policies are scabs. They are, and they would have been called that by Cesar Chavez. They would have been called that by the Democrats of yesteryear. Why are they defending them at the expense of the Americans who are at the bottom of the ladder like that as well? And the same would then go for, I remember Ian Coulter talking about this like 8 years ago, when it comes to social services, right? Well, that comes at the expense. Here's the thing, right? There's this fantasy of the growing pie. The thing is, even if you assume that the pie grows at time T, where time T is this current instant, it hasn't grown yet. So there's still going to be a huge amount of competition for those services at the bottom. Okay. That's just how it's going to be. And you're hoping, based on some, mythology, that it will grow and eventually be able to account for all this. Except it hasn't. And it still hasn't. And as we covered in our Mamdani video last week, almost all of his policies are just, triage for the capitalist system. Because, rent freezes, free transportation, free childcare, right, the wages are going down because they can afford to pay you less, but the demand for all these services are going up because there's more people chasing these services. So this is just, it doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks the can down the road a little bit. That's not radical. That's not even New Deal level radical. I mean, not that FDR was a, quote, radical. He wasn't a socialist. But even his policies were more, for example, nobody's saying we should reinstate Glass-Steagall. But it was FDR that imposed Glass-Steagall that prevented banks from wild, endless speculation that Bill Clinton removed and created all of these crises. A real Democrat, a real progressive, a real socialist, whoever you want to call yourself, would demand the reinstation of Glass-Steagall. But nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about this. And so what happens is these scabs, these groups that are now furthermore, and I might have mentioned this with Mamdani, or I might not have, because these groups, whether they be immigrants or racial minorities or women or sexual minorities, it is now legally binding that you hire them. So not hiring them would be against the law. And so now what you've done is you've created a dependent class of scabs who now you are legally bound to hire, which makes it functionally impossible for labor organizing to actually happen. The very conditions, legal and environmental conditions necessary to allow for this are undercut because the corporation can just say, well, look, I'm legally bound to hire these people. I can't refuse them. And so what do you do? Well, one, it kind of short circuits the labor movement. So, well, wait a minute, aren't these protected minority groups, or but they're scabs, but they're protected minority groups, but they're scabs. And so it kind of short circuits that, but it also gives power to the employer. So the employer can say, well, look, I have to hire these people. I can't not, that's against the law. And so this whole galaxy of democratic policies serves to reinforce a labor environment that is antithetical to effective organizing and bringing power back to the hands of labor. And it's completely opposite of that. And this is what the Democratic Party represents. And we know that the control wielded by these oligarchs. We see this again with the superdelegates, which is their fail-safe so that they don't lose to these more, quote, populist, progressive Democratic candidates. And so what I would argue needs to be done is this needs to be continually pointed out, because the support of the Democratic Party today in the United States is still based on this inertia of thinking it's the party of FDR or the party, the party of Jackson, these populist working class issues. It's still that inertia that drives the party, right? The party of the little guy, right? That's maybe where most people see it now. But it's the exact opposite of that now. Everything they stand for is against that actually happening. And so, they're like I mentioned already with their opposition to Trump's ICE policy. These people are undocumented workers. They're undercutting the American worker. So again, this needs to be pointed out, because there's no other way to get around the fact the Democratic Party has completely pivoted from what it once was historically as a political party. And, ultimately that needs to be called out, because the problems that we are facing economically and socially and culturally are downstream from all this. And if we keep pretending that's not a problem, it's only going to get worse. Now, I'm not saying that the Democratic Party couldn't make an about face. I think that might be hard. I think that, the solution I proposed was, look, just call things what they are. Just treat all of these social issues as economic issues and just don't take the bait. That would be the best way for an insurgent movement within the Democratic Party to reclaim its former position. Though I don't really see anybody doing that, nor do I see any indication that they might. Florian.
Yeah, that might be indeed very difficult to have an insurgency movement from within the Democratic Party, because their rank and file now present the managerial professional class, or the PMC, and they are very, very difficult to dislodge. You talked about the super delegates that Hillary got in 2016 for her nomination. Well, Barack Obama in 2008 basically outflanked Hillary Clinton by getting the support from super delegates first. And so that was basically the story behind the stage that happened with Obama versus Clinton in 2008, was that Obama was surging in terms of getting more super delegates on his side. Maybe that was already preordained, and they just played out like a little theater for the masses. But that's actually what happened. You had more and more super delegates declare for Obama, not for Clinton. And one of them, for example, Ted Kennedy. I think Ted was his name, right? The last brother of like the John and Robert, JFK and RFK, and then it was Ted Kennedy. He was in favor, like we was a big super delegate for Obama and so on. So that tells you that it's probably very difficult if you see Obama, he was displayed as some sort of insurgent, and he basically took the super delegates. Someone like Bernie Sanders would have had to do the same, and it's like it is in Europe. Like in Germany, you don't have, and I shouldn't say in Europe, in Germany, you don't have direct, you have half of it. Half the vote is direct mandates. The other half is over party lists. That's similar to super delegates, right? So basically you have people that are ranked number 1, 2, 3, number 10. And that means if the party gets a majority of of so and so many percentage, and they get 300 seats in the parliament, then everyone ranked between 1 and 300 gets in. If they are, it doesn't matter if they have been directly voted for by people in their county or not. So that's very European, but it also means it's not as democratic as it's not as populist democratic as the Republicans are, right? So it also means that donors have more sway over Dems than Republicans, as you said. The issue of the voting machines is very interesting because it was a big thing in 2004 when Kerry lost. There was in Ohio there was a discrepancy with the voting machines. You had this incident with the "Don't Tase Me, Bro" guy, if anyone remembers. He basically stood up in a town hall and attacked Kerry. He said, "I'm a Democrat, and why aren't you investigating the voting machines?" And then they basically the security and police carried him out, and he said, "Don't tase me, bro." So, but it was people talked about that in 2004 when they wanted to unseat George W. Bush, and then afterwards they haven't talked about it anymore. There was no talk about voting machine with Obama's election. There was a little bit of talk of voting machines in 2016 with Hillary's loss, and 2020 there was a lot of talk about voting machines. These things aren't really safe, right? So basically, I'm not as deep into the matter, uh, so I can't speak completely confident on that. But I remember some videos where you could supposedly hack the machines with a USB stick and stuff like that. And it sounds like unsafe. They wouldn't print out a paper ballot, or the paper ballots have to be retabulated separately. And it just seems like a not very well fortified technology that you use for a very, very important act of government, right? The election. So that's one thing. Then I also agree that diversity is a strike-breaking tactic in and of itself. And I was surprised when I started to read more American literature. Maybe not the classic literature, but I read Airframe by Michael Crichton in the 90s, or maybe beginning of 2000s, and it was about the airplane incident, and it was also about labor unions. So Crichton described the labor unions that are at play in a aircraft manufacturer like Boeing, and those unions, as he described them, they were vicious. They would actually not, someone doesn't play ball, they would actually beat him up and stuff like that. Unthinkable in German unions. Germany also has labor union, or had them. They're not as important there either, but they never really beat anyone up. So maybe German unions are just weaker than the Americans. But that was, I thought when I read that, I thought, wow, that's a real force, right? So if you get on the wrong side of the labor unions in the U.S., you don't want that. I don't think they have that power anymore. I don't think they can beat anyone up. I don't think they can be a robust political presence because they're just abandoned, sort of, right? But the problem for the Democrats is that they have become the party, as I said, of the PMC, professor managerial class. And so you have lawyers, academics, NGO workers, journalists, tech sector employees, knowledge economy workers, whatever that means. And they dominate the party staffing, think tanks, the framing to the media, the contact with the donors and lobbyists. So that's a very entrenched class in and of itself. It's very difficult to dislodge because, I mean, where do you start, right? The bureaucracy is very difficult to get rid of, at least from the bottom, right? If you want to get rid of a bureaucracy, you need to do it from the top. You need to have a government mandate that says we're getting rid of this and this agency. But from the bottom up, you can't get rid of them, right? And then they are funded through the managerial class that facilitates that. They get all the Wall Street, Silicon Valley, entertainment, universities, pharmaceutical companies. They all give the Democratic Party beaucoup money. And from that point, it's really difficult. It's difficult to dislodge the PMC, managerial class. It's also difficult to dislodge them because they bring in the money, right? So nobody really wants to get rid of them. And then, the working class, minorities, immigrant communities, they're just basically They get some identity-based political appeals, and so then they get mobilized. But they don't have a real sway in the Democratic Party. I don't think so. I mean, there's a Mamdani love fest in New York City, apparently, but do these people really have a say when Mamdani has to like negotiate his policies with Albany, like with the capital of New York, where New York City can't act independently of New York State? And then all these people that voted enthusiastically for Mamdani, they will be kind of left outside. I don't think that they have real political power. They're like I think maybe Keith would call them useful idiots. In a way, they are, right. And and then you have the big PMC that will also guarantee that the existing system is just maintained, right? So basically, the existing system would get more access to markets. They don't alter any access of power to markets. They will expand it. They will regulate capitalism. They will never confront it. And they're certainly never interested in a solution. A management bureaucracy is not interested in solutions. They're interested in managing things. Like you give money to the NGOs that manage homelessness. They are interested in more tent cities going up, not getting these people into an apartment. They want to have more social workers, right? Because how they can hire more people, right? This is basically, if you want to see it in Marxist terms, it would probably be like bourgeois politics, not proletarian politics, right? And that's a big problem. That's why the Democratic Party is kind of log jammed. I don't see them change. And I think from a Democrat point of view, the populism, the pro-labor stuff, that's being taken up by Nick Fuentes and American First. I don't think the Democrats have anything to say for the real working class. Those people like Nick Fuentes and other America First people. I mean, I don't like it. I don't like him. And you may think about policy what you will, but they actually occupy the gap that the Democrats left, right? So that's the problem of the Democratic Party. But the problem is also that you have a managerial class that will these things just keep being elected. I don't think the Democratic Party will collapse anytime soon because they have such a strong foundation that doesn't get anything done, but can also not vanish. So it's like an albatross around left-wing politics. And maybe if you want real left-wing politics, it has to go through the right wing for the time being, and then can later on veer more to the left. But if I was a real Marxist, which I'm certainly not, but if I was, I would probably try to latch myself onto America First, and then later on pivot more to the left. I wouldn't try to get allies in the Democratic Party. I think.
You broke up, Florian. Okay. Florian. Let's see here.
All right. You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was basically almost done. I was saying that immigration is more in line with the managerial class of the Democrats. But what I find, what just the thing that if I'm a real Marxist, I go through America First, not through the Democratic Party.
Yeah. So the thing that's interesting here, I'll start with the voting machines and the potential for fraud, right? Because the Democratic Party once was the party of mass democracy, going back to Andrew Jackson, and the idea of transparent elections, right? You want to have a secret ballot. You didn't want people to know who was casting those votes. So, for example, during 2020, during that election cycle, when the votes were counted, a lot of people complained that there were certain locations that you weren't allowed to see who was doing the counting or where. That's the kind of tactics that you'd see with like small town corrupt political machines. So in 1946, there was the Battle of Tennessee, where returning GIs were trying to upend a corrupt political machine that had controlled their town. And there's an actual brief battle that took place, but leading up to that battle, the local machine took the ballot boxes into the courthouse and didn't allow anyone in. And everybody was like, "Oh, they're gonna, stuff the ballot box. This is gonna be fraud." That just whether or not that is you're doing fraud, it just screams fraud. And that's, of course, what really escalated the Battle of Athens. And again, why would the Democrats be in favor of this? It's just against the stated principles that they once represented. If you don't have, open, I mean, the idea of a machine and being programmed to count votes, the way it can be hijacked for fraudulent purposes is pretty obvious. I mean, so why would that be your go-to, right? I mean, as a Democrat, you would say, no, we want to have free, fair, open elections. We don't want, we want people to be there to watch who casts the votes and who counts them. So independent third party, right? That used to be their thing. But, now it's different. The other thing that needs to be brought up is beginning in 2018, there was a movement. There's a movement called Walk Away, #WalkAway, where a lot of Democrats were realigning with Trump. And I think we can view RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard as two examples of walk. I remember at the time I thought, man, Walk Away is going to be really important. We're going to see a lot of realignment with Democrats. And so, for example, Elon Musk used to vote Democrat, right? And so did Joe Rogan, right? So I think what we're also seeing too is that not constituency, but those people who either were Democrat people, party members like RFK Jr., or those who were prominent spokesmen for it, have shifted, right? And this goes into the whole woke culture war element, which a lot of more bread and butter Democrats didn't like. That's why the Blue Dogs voted for Trump in 2016, right? They didn't like being dissed by the Democratic establishment. That's the voter base. But then there were also party members who didn't like it, like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. So I think when we look at that, we can say that element of the Democrats that would have still held on to the more traditional principles was driven out, right? And arguably you could say, I'm not comfortable saying that it began with Walk Away, but Walk Away is a point you can start tracking it in the political landscape where they are starting to move, pivot, and shift away. And eventually they got rather cozy with Trump. Now, Trump is unique in that another Republican probably couldn't have done that. I don't think any of the other older Republican establishment types could have pulled this off. There's something different about Trump that allowed that to happen. And that's why I think, and not only myself, but some of the, quote, MAGA communists, if you've heard about them, think this too, that the Republican Party actually has more chance to be a Labor Party than the Democrats currently today. So that would be a separate topic, but that's another interesting thing to think about. And also, is the other thing that you mentioned, Florian, that is relevant, we can build off of is, the idea of the managerial class. Also, we can say college educated, right? So a lot of these college educated people are more likely to vote Democrat and support the Democrats, and their interests are fairly wildly different than the working class. See, part of the problem, right, with these people is it's funny, right? The Democrats keep complaining about white flight and gentrification. So either the white people leave a community and make it poor, so minorities get hurt, or they move in and the cost of living goes up, which also hurts minorities. So, damn if you don't, right? But who are these white people doing this? They're liberals. Let's be honest. These are white liberals who keep moving around, and they don't like their policies. We see this with the those that go from California to Austin. We see this to go from California to Utah or Colorado. These are the Democrats doing this. So they don't expose themselves to the costs of their own policies because they have enough wealth, right? And well, first of all, the way they work is more easily converted to telecommuting. That wasn't necessarily the case, say, in 2000. But now a lot of that work can be done through telecommuting. And I think COVID and the lockdowns sped that process up. So you could teach your online class anywhere in the world, right? You don't have to be in Berkeley. So you can just keep moving around, right? And so these costs don't really accrue to you directly. But if you were like, say, dock workers or miners or what little manufacturing is left, well, you don't have that luxury. You just can't up and move and be a digital nomad, right? So that's a problem. And I think part of it is because of the way they make their money, they're just sheltered from these costs and they just don't care. Like, So, like in the 10 cities in California, right? If you're like above a certain income threshold, you're in this really nice part of town and you never have to deal with any of this. Everybody else, well, sucks to be you. You've got to put up with drug users and violent criminals and then courts that catch and release violent criminals because they're not really bad. They're not really violent criminals. It's just oppression, bro. So it's like, okay, now you have these guys back on the street again. And again, if you are above a certain income threshold, you just don't have to deal with that, right? You're in a essentially gated community, or you can just go somewhere else in the country and then work that way. And I think that's another reason why this shift to the college-educated managerial section of of society that the Democrats draw their support from, voting support, it's because they can shield themselves from it, and it's easier and easier. Now, those at the very, very bottom, like the immigrants that vote for them, well, they have, like I mentioned, with the economic reasons that Mamdani has. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's just self-interest why they would do that. But we've also seen the idea that, so when Trump ran in 2016, the idea was that the Hispanic vote and the black vote would just be locked down Democrat forever. I still think they probably lean more Democrat than Republican, but certainly Trump has challenged that assessment that they're just going to be forever locked down to the Democrats. In part, I believe, because immigrants are competing for the same jobs in social services. And it turns out, especially in his 2016 election, that those Hispanics who were born here or came here legally don't appreciate the fact that all these illegals are doing this. So the Democrats have this superficial racial reading that they're all going to vote Democrat because they're Hispanic. It's like, well, no, there's also these economic factors, which you guys used to talk about, right? And so all of that gets tied up into it as well. But again, I have to emphasize, none of this has anything to do with what the Democratic Party used to represent. And it represents policies that are harmful to the, quote, poorest elements in the country. Florian.
Yeah, especially like what you talked about the Democrats. It seems like they are NIMBYists. That's what other people also said. NIMBYists are people that say "not in my backyard," right? They want to have like homes for the asylum seekers. I forgot the name for that, but yeah, that's very important, right? But then if some hapless communal politician magistrate um, accidentally proposes to put one of these homeless shelters or asylum homes next to nice properties on the white picket fences, then they become viciously opposed to that. Yeah, in principle, yes, but not in our backyard, and that's exactly what it is. Not in my backyard, right? NIMBY. There was in when was that? In 2022, some of the Republican states, they sent immigrants to Martha's Vineyard and stuff like that. And lo and behold, those immigrants were gone by before the day was over. They basically all the people that lived there came together and said, no, we don't want them here, and then they were gone, right? But on the other hand, if you especially also with criminals that are released early on the street and so on. There's a book, Left Behind in Rosedale. I think the author's last name is Cummings. And he interviews, I think he's a leftist. And he, like a leftist college professor in the 1960s or 70s, and he interviewed a local village, Rosedale, which was mainly octogenarian, and the crowd above 50 years old lived there, right? It was more or less young people had moved out and the old people remained, or elderly people. And you had more and more immigrants put into that community, and and in that case, I was also a lot of blacks, and they would actually dispossess the white people by kicking them out. Like they would basically take over streets and basically beat up some of the residents until the residents really wanted to go voluntarily by themselves. And you can attribute that to racial strife of the 60s and 70s, but it's the same mechanism if you put in like lots of people from, let's say, immigrants. Like if you put millions of immigrants into a country, not so that they are more than 0.1% of the population, they form their own tribes again. and especially some of these immigrants are very tribal, like Indians, for example. They will very much prefer their own. So they basically surround themselves with all other Indians or all other people from their own tribe, and then the white people get kicked out, or the people, maybe not always white people, the people that live there, they're dispossessed basically. They're being like voluntarily moved out, more or less, right? Then you have what happened in Hawaii and in Palisades in California, huge forest fires, right? Which we know, at least in California, there was arson, right? They were not really naturally occurring forest fires. They were like some people put trees under fire, and then you had a big forest fire. Palisades was completely devastated. The people that live there, they're not getting like reimbursed by the state. No, they get slow rolled, and then Newsom comes in with his donors, and they buy all those properties on the cheap. Same in Hawaii, Honolulu, where there also was big forest fires. Yet in Honolulu, had this big woo-woo water guy who said, "Yeah, we need to acknowledge the indigenous wishes, and the water is sacred, and we can't just have like basins of water filled." Yeah, so there was no water available to fight against the fires, and a whole city, a whole villages, whole streets burned down, and those property people are not getting that back. The property is going to be bought off for cheap, and you there's a little bit of an odd timing coincidence, right? It's almost like I don't think it was space lasers that put trees under fire, but there's certainly like I say, like a capitalist coalition of convenience, right? All of a sudden, oh, that's nice. The people all had to flee. Their properties are now up for sale. We can just take them on the cheap. And so that's also Democrat policy, right? That's also one way in which donors and capitalists actually buying their way, using the Democratic Party to get themselves cheap property. And that's also one thing that the Democrats stand for, unfortunately. And it seems they are all doing whatever they can. Not only do they not represent the working class anymore, they actually are acting against them. They're actually screwing them. And this is very interesting why they would do that. But maybe they just think they can do that. They can do that. They want what they have, and they're just going to kick them out. Period.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we're observing here is the outward effects of an attempted takeover. So, right, if we roll back the clock in time, the sort of economic reforms, the New Deal reforms that FDR put in, were certainly not popular with these economic classes. Part of the justification was, well, we want to avoid a revolution, and there was a lot of labor violence with employers and corporations. So at the time, I think a lot of wealthy individuals said, well, this is the lesser of two evils because, in the end, we don't want a revolution here in this country. And I also think that they probably believed they could roll it back, which they did, right? Began in the 80s. They started to effectively roll back all of these restrictions. And at the same time, right, they were able to position themselves as defending these oppressed minority groups. And what's interesting is you could say that Occupy Wall Street was sort of like the high watermark of what was left of that old anti-globalist, anti-banking, anti-capitalist left. And it just, in 2012, it pivots completely. And then it becomes all about these cultural issues, right, which don't actually threaten the establishment. And there's a really good video by a guy named V Radio where he talks about that particular change. And he's an anarchist, old school leftist. He was at the Occupy movements. That's very interesting. He also, in that video, he has a segment where he reads some 4chan post from a guy who was at Occupy Wall Street, one of the Occupy movements. And he said that when the progressive stack was introduced, all the white guys just got shot down and they couldn't say anything. And he's like, that's why we couldn't organize anything after that point. That's why we couldn't do any successful action against it. And yeah, all of this just has this this pivot. And given my culture war narrative, I argue that they were agent provocateurs, from whether you want to call it corporations, the deep state, or both, because in some sense they're so closely aligned, it's hard to separate them. That we're starting to be like pressure points leading the movement in certain ways, so that it would devolve into infighting, into nothing, right? And that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, those party insiders that have been there for a long time, if they get paid well, they're going to have an economic interest in just going along with the flow, right? Well, it's different now, but we're still doing fine. We're still doing fine, right? And you start to believe your own BS, right? When you get to that point. And then for the more wealthier voters, right, who are college educated, come from the managerial class, because of their mode of employment and because of the higher income bracket they come from, again, NIMBYism, like you said, they can shelter themselves from these policies, but the negative externalities of the result of these policies. But what it does do for them, so from the corporate point of view, the people that run the factories and the large mega corporations, it lowers the cost of labor, so you can pay people less. And see, I have a theory that, so when the woke got really big, there was this idea that, well, there's all these qualified people, women and minorities, who aren't getting hired for these STEM jobs. And, it's just racism. What I think was actually going on was, there was a right-wing critique that said, well, look, when those people start getting those jobs, our infrastructure is going to fall apart. I don't think they were ever going to get those jobs. See, in the highly competitive labor market that we have, most people don't really know their real value in the economy. So even if you were, say, a high-performing, high IQ white guy who got an engineering degree and was eventually going to work at, I don't know, Google or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, you didn't know that you were going to get the job. They wanted you to think that you were competing on an even platform with all these other minority groups, even if the hirers were never going to actually do that. Because they all they want to do is lower the cost of labor. It doesn't matter, they don't hire all those other people, and those other people then become a pressure group for the culture war. So it's still a win-win, because they then redirect that anger not from being upward directed to horizontally against these other white guys that got hired, right? And so I think that's part of what's going on here. And the idea then is, if you go down a level, then, well, what do all these do? Well, the more aesthete urbanite types are going to be like, oh, well, we get all this cultural enrichment, which, I mean, I don't know. I guess they'd like that. I mean, that's a very liberal, touchy-feely thing to do. And of course, if you don't have to deal with the externalities of that, and you can just get like the higher end version, you can still say, oh, look, I'm this cosmopolitan, enjoying all this, foreign food and art. And you don't have to deal with like the stuff at the bottom that other Americans have to deal with. And so part of it is that's just weird, because you have that element, where they just want this like performative cultural consumption. But also, too, it lowers prices for them. So as consumers, they can buy this stuff at lower prices, because by lowering the cost of labor, corporations can then sell these things at lower prices in the first place. So real quick, Seamus O'Blaine says lower the cost of labor, but gives $150K for email jobs. I don't know which email jobs you're talking about. I mean, some of these are probably just tokens. Oh, and tokens is a good point, too. So leading up to 2012, Occupy Wall Street and many other people were like, well, look, tokens are just when corporations hire minorities to deflect attention away from capitalist exploitation. And they're like, we want real reforms, blah, blah, blah. We don't want 10 years later, boop, we're okay. OMG, we love tokens now. None of these people who were complaining about tokenism in 2010 and 2011, who were on the left and the Democratic Party, are complaining about it now. Because ultimately they just didn't care. It was just performative. It was just like, okay, I don't think so. For me, that's just a sign that my suspicions were correct. These people didn't really ever mean it. It's easy to be pretend to be against something, But when you actually have to like bear the cost of being against it, it's, not so much. Florian.
Yeah, Seamus asked, would Seamus when asked for give 150K for email jobs lower the cost of labor? Yeah, I think 150K is a fixed expense, right? You pay basically if you look at an income statement of any company, you have the revenue that what the company takes in by selling their job, and then you have cost of goods and services, and that often labor is often part of that. If you go to accounting, labor is, if you need to make more latches, for example, or more shoes, you can do that by hiring more labor or putting down the amount of labor that or the money that labor gets. So labor is a variable cost in many cases. 150K for an email job, that's an administrative overhead. That's often not, and it's true. And it's true. It doesn't make much sense that you lower the cost of labor while then paying the administrators more. But that's a system where we are, right? Administrative costs, they get separately accounted for, and they can just take the money. There's no fear of paying too much for administrators, and those email jobs come from that. So that could be one part of the reason. But why there's yeah.
Real quick to your point, that's absolutely right. Because the left would criticize how CEOs kept getting bonuses and raises,
Yeah.
while everybody else got fired and got cuts. Well, yeah, if you're in that upper crust, you still get all that money coming to you. So go ahead.
Right, but also the Democratic Party has been overtaken by the managerial class, and of course they take a lot of money because then money is needed, right? Yeah, for the Democratic Party, but not for the labor they're supposed to stand up for. I think the managerial class recognized that woke was a way for them to grow in power, and also what Keith mentioned and Paul Gottfried and others have said, that woke is basically a modern Protestant movement, right? So you don't believe in God so much, but you believe in you basically have all the pieties and all the frameworks that the Protestant religion often has and had, and they just woke has many aspects of that. I also remember that when Slumdog Millionaire came out, that was a movie. In 2008, it came out. It was a movie about a basically rags to riches story, but in India, not in America. And my girlfriend at that time, she was very liberal. She actually still is, and she was very happy that they brought out Slumdog Millionaire. And she told me that, and I was new in the U.S. at that point. She told me that, yeah, this is now Hollywood recognizes the roles that Indian have in the American economy, and soon we'll have that more recognized. She was all excited about that. So looking back at that, that tells me that the Democratic Party doesn't just get support from Hollywood. No. They craft the narrative as well, right? So whatever comes in Hollywood in a movie, whatever Hollywood displays, that becomes part of the narrative, and then will inform the next policy proposals that the Democrats have. That's what it seems to be.
Yeah, and I guess now that we're nearing the end of this show, I'll sort of summarize some of the points that we've made, because we've covered a lot here. So, firstly, beginning with some of even the Obama years, with some far left commentators, they tracked this corporate donor shift towards the Democratic Party. Now, in hindsight, we can look at the pivot after 2011 to 2012 from Occupy Wall Street to this culture war ramping up again. We could see that as possibly greasing the skids for that, getting it set up so that this could happen. But then also, through things like superdelegates, they can ensure that a true populist candidate doesn't get in, which makes them less democratic than the RNC, where Trump did this dark horse insurgency in 2016. Then also, we've got all of these interest groups, these minority interest groups, the whole civil rights thing. See, my theory is that the whole civil rights thing is itself just strike breaking. That's what happened. See, because you'll hear people say that, well, you had all these social services start becoming insolvent and breaking down in the 70s and 80s, which is what fed into the Reaganite revolution to want to defund all these things. Post 1965 is post civil rights. I don't see why any of that stuff would have been, quote, insolvent if we'd have just kept going the way we were before 1965. So, from FDR, down to JFK, they seem to be solid. It's the social engineering aspects that come with the civil rights movement that become these cost sinks. If you hadn't engaged in that, you wouldn't have oversaturated the ability of the government to actually pay for these services. And the other problem is the social engineering just didn't work. It's all in now. It just didn't work. Now, I'm not here to speculate as to why or was there some other way. We just know it didn't work. And that was never a part of FDR's plan. Remember, most of his support came from the Deep South. He didn't challenge segregation. So, his plan, that economic policy plan didn't have anything to do with civil rights and that broader whole thing. And so what this does then is you have all these groups which function as scabs, strike breakers. You've got the Whole Foods heat map. And now you have to hire them because, it's, they're legally protected. You have to hire these people. So it makes it almost impossible to organize a strike. You're going to beat up a legally protected minority. You don't want that. The Teamsters might get into trouble if they did that. And so there's that. And then, of course, you've got the Democrats themselves, who are the college-educated bureaucratic employees who can shelter themselves from the negative externalities of these problems, right? And then also you have the effect at the bottom where lower class income Americans are competing with immigrants for the same services, social services, and jobs. And that just puts more pressure on them than would otherwise be the case. Right. And so that's in summary my case. Florian?
I think that's a really good point that nobody talks much about. With after 1965, you take the right of self-determination away for the American people or for the people that were there before, and then like after several decades, you can't even form proper unions anymore, right? Because yeah, as you said, you're legally obligated to hire scabs, if you wish, right? So basically, that's enshrined. Scabism is enshrined in the modern constitution, in a way, right? I think, yeah, I don't know where this will end for the Democrats, but I don't think the Democrats will change much. It will all, as I said, come out from the right, all the economic populism. Even someone like Mamdani, he won't get much done in terms of pro labor class, pro working class policies. I don't think there will anything be there. So it's gonna be America first or bust in a way.
All right. Well, thanks again, Florian. This is Todd Lewis, the President Fly Podcast, signing off.